Joining us here today. We are really very proud to present the first edition of ILSA's Diplomacy Days. My name is Altamash Khalil. I'm an international and European law student, and I'll be co-moderating today's event with my fellow colleague, Camilla Ors.
Welcome everyone, my name is Camila Oros and I hope you will enjoy today's event.
So before we start today's much-awaited event with Your Excellency, I would like to invite the President of the International Law Student Association, the Hague chapter, Bianca Maria Liahu, to briefly present our organization. Bianca?
Yes, thank you very much, Altamash. And once again, welcome everyone and welcome Your Excellency. It is a great honor having you here, and thank you again for accepting our invitation. So a few words about ILSA. ILSA The Hague chapter is a study association within the International and European Law program at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. And the purpose of this association is to promote the study, profession, and development of international law. And such goal is achieved through the efforts of the ILSA supporters and members, as ILSA works through different subgroups, namely the Main Events Committee, the Social Events Committee, the Journal Committee, and from this week, the debut of the ILSA Ambassador Committee. All these committees and teams work together to organize events, workshops, and projects for the students of the Hague University and for all the supporters and all the legal professionals in the international law field. Thank you very much, and I really hope you all enjoy today's session.
Thank you, Bianca. Now moving on to officially commencing today's event. Just quickly for our attendees, we would like to tell them how today's event is going to go. So we will engage in a dialogue with His Excellency, particularly on his life as a diplomat, the bilateral relationships between France and the Netherlands, and the topic of today's event, climate change. We would like to warmly welcome today's honored guest. He holds a traditional position that has arisen from international practices, the permanent establishment of the embassies in the 16th century. He has vast experience with international relations and diplomacy. Amongst other distinguished positions, he was the spokesperson and advisor for the Embassy of France to the United States, as well as Secretary and Deputy to the Press Advisor. It is with great pleasure that we would like to welcome the Ambassador of France to the Netherlands, Louis Vassy. Your Excellency, you have the floor.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm really glad to be here and to be able to engage with you. Students I know from a very varied background from all over the world and from Europe specifically, I guess, but from beyond also. It's of course, as we might touch upon during our conversation, one key element of our work as an embassy is to make sure we interact with all those that are interested in international relations, and I'm really glad to be with you today to do that. Then I'm in your hands to proceed. I'm more at ease in the exercise of question and answers, but tell me if you want me to introduce myself beyond what you said, or if you want me to start with a general presentation of what we do as an embassy. I'm also happy to do that. So just tell me how you want to proceed.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think we can start with the questions, just so we can get to know you better through our personal interests and the interest that the students had through the form and the interest that they expressed. So, Your Excellency, thank you again for accepting our invitation. We are extremely honored to have you here, and we are looking forward to learning more about your journey. Now, we would like to start by asking a few questions regarding your role as an ambassador. And the first question would be regarding the fact that we see that you have a vast experience in the field of international relations and diplomacy. So please tell us about the steps you took to reach this position, particularly your domain of education and your career up to this point.
Well, for anyone that is familiar with the French educational system, I would say, have a pretty classical experience, in the sense that I started, of course, in our main. In France, you don't have like here in the Netherlands so many divisions in terms of high school education. So I went to the traditional, let's say, generalist high school. After that, I went to the Paris Institute for Political Sciences, Sciences Po in Paris. In that framework, I spent 1 year in Dublin as an exchange student at Trinity College. And while I was in Dublin, I decided, because that's my thing in life, to prepare for another selective exam that we have to enter the École Normale Supérieure, which is kind of a smaller selective university, which I did, and I went to the economics and sociology department there. So at that point, I was following two full-time educations, one at Sciences Po Paris and the other one at the École Normale Supérieure. I did that for a couple of years, and after my master's, I decided to take another selective exam for the National School of Administration, which in France trains the higher civil servants. I was selected, and in that framework, you spend 2 more years in a kind of educational training program, which puts together academic elements and, of course, on-the-ground training, so including in embassies and in local authorities of the government. At the end of these 2 years, it's a pretty Mandarinal system. You get a ranking at the end, and according to your ranking, you can choose the positions you're interested in the administration. And some of them, there were some openings at the foreign ministry, and since that was my goal when I entered the school, I decided to enter the foreign ministry. At that point, I was 24. I spent 2 years first dealing with, from Paris, from the headquarters, dealing with French-India relations. After that, I moved to the non-proliferation department, so I was very much engaged on issues relating to the pertinent use of civil nuclear energy as a source of energy, as well as some counter-proliferation initiatives. As you mentioned, after these 4 years in Paris, I went to Washington. I spent there 4 years, 2 years as the deputy spokesperson of the embassy, and 2 more years as the head of the press office and spokesperson of the embassy. At that point, I came back to Paris, this time at the Defense Ministry, where I spent 5 years dealing with international relations. After I completed these 5 years, I moved again to the Foreign Ministry as Deputy Chief of Staff to the Foreign Minister. And that is when, after 2 more years, the foreign minister and the president in France suggested I could come here to the Netherlands as the ambassador, which of course I gladly accepted. And here I am. I've been here now for a couple of years, a little less than 2 years, at a very interesting times in terms of the development of the French-Dutch relations.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
So I am afraid there is no better answer than to say that you need to be good at school and interested, of course, in international relations. I guess that's another precondition.
Thank you, Your Excellency. However, you did mention that you started at an early age of 24 to take interest in foreign relations, and it's quite fascinating and impressive. So, on that note, would like to know, what is diplomacy for you, and what would you say are the most important traits that define a great ambassador?
Oh, that's a difficult one because it's not for me necessarily to. I guess each of us in the profession has different definitions. I would start in any case by saying that it's a very, very varied and diverse job in a sense. And the context in which you act, of course, makes a huge difference in what you have to do and what is expected from you. So it's not exactly the same to be the ambassador in Baghdad or to be the ambassador in The Hague, obviously. And also because of the context, but also there is a major trait that you need to keep in mind, which is the split, the difference between what we call a bilateral diplomacy. So that's what you do in an embassy in a country, and multilateral diplomacy, which is what you do when you are when you represent your country in an international organization, so in the UN or in more specialized multilateral organizations. It so happens that here in the Netherlands, the ambassadors does both, because I'm at the same time the bilateral ambassador to the Netherlands and the ambassador to the OPCW, so the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as well as the representative towards the courts that are here in The Hague, and specifically the International Criminal Court, but also some other more specific criminal courts that have been set in place over the last few decades. And in a sense, these are quite different jobs. In one context, you really negotiate texts, agreements that will become binding to everyone in the multilateral framework. In the bilateral job, you're really in charge of deepening relations between two countries, and it has less to do with negotiations in a sense than with project management and making sure that the increased links that you are trying to foster between the two countries are indeed developing and going in the right direction. It's also a job about analysis of the country where you are, understanding the foundations of the positions that are taken by the country where you are, understanding not most of the time, all the time, a country takes on the international stage positions that are related to internal imperatives or constraints, and of course it's the job of the embassy to be able to analyze them as properly as possible, to make sure that you understand where people come from and what the common ground can be when you are working together. So the two ways of working in the multilateral and in the bilateral are quite different. Then, what are the qualities of an ambassador? I think it's fair to say that it's a very, very generalist job. So you need to be able to interact with the press and be a good spokesperson, as well as understanding some pretty technical issues that you might end up dealing with. And even if you're not necessarily in charge of setting them in motion or crafting the position on technical issues, you by all means, if you want to be good at your job, you need to understand what is at stake, and also understand the connection that there is between a subject that can seem very technical in first hand, but that in fact can easily become a very political subject. And on the other hand, a political discussion seems sometimes a bit stratospheric, but always has implications at the more technical level. And so I guess it's this ability to navigate easily between the very political and the very technical that makes a good ambassador in the end.
Thank you for your answer, Your Excellency. So, connected to the first two questions, where you expressed how vast of an experience you have into the field, we are pretty curious, especially for the students who want to follow this path. Which work experience would you say has been the one that pushed you the most in terms of future opportunities arising out of it?
As work experience, I think I would mention. Well, to be honest, I've been very lucky to have a very rich career so far. So each step has been, in a way of improving. I would simply say that it's not only the job, to be completely honest, but it's also the people you meet. And in the early stages of my career, I think it's fair to say I've observed a lot my bosses and trying to take inspiration from what they would do and the way they were working to also improve my own abilities in a way. So it's I think it's important to find the right role models and try to simply not copy, of course, but find inspiration and then adapt to your own style and experience. But I think I wouldn't though mention really two specific experiences among the ones I've evoked. I think the most structural one, a very important one, was the moment in Washington where I was dealing with the press. Why? Because actually I think it's one of the most difficult jobs we can have for two sets of reasons. One, because when the press is good, it's never thanks to you. It's always thanks to the sound policy that has been set in place. But when there is a problem with the press, it's certainly the fault of the spokesperson. So it's actually a job where you need to be pretty modest in a way, because it's not about you, it's about the message that you want to convey. And again, you need to accept that when it goes well, it's not thanks to you, and when there is a problem, it's necessarily your fault, and you need to take responsibility for it. So in terms of attitude, I think it's an interesting experience. And then I would say it's a very subtle job, because you need to be interesting enough so that the press takes on your message. And so you need actually, again, to be very accurate on the substance to make sure that people are actually interested by what you say. If you're too neutral or too boring, your message won't be conveyed, because no one will be really interested. But you don't want to be too interesting, because if you're too interesting, it means you've said too much, and you become the story because you made a blunder or gave information that you were not supposed to give, etc. So it's a very balanced act in which you need to understand and strike the right balance and find the right line between briefing enough, saying enough, and not saying too much, because it remains a line of work, diplomacy, where not everything needs to be in the public sphere or the public space, if only because sometimes you're still discussing some issues, and so you can't expose them, or then you take the risk to have a whole process crumbling in a way. So that was a very important and key foundational experience for me. It was also a time, because I was there between 2008 and 12, where we started from Washington. It was really the beginning of social media and things that seem now very not only normal, but have gained some hegemony. But at the time, it was the beginning of the first blogs in international relations. There was a whole restructuring of the press. with newcomers, and so it was really fun to be at the embassy because we were the first ones actually at the French embassy in Washington at the time to establish relations with all these newcomers from the digital press, from the non-traditional media, and it was fascinating to observe all these new talents that were emerging from the press. And the second experience, I think, that has been really key for me is moving to the defense ministry, because it takes you outside of your comfort zone where you are really with colleagues at the foreign ministry and meet always the same people, etc. I was exposed to other ways of thinking and other experiences from people that have been deployed on the ground, abroad, etc. And so that was really that made that was really key in the sense of being able to adapt, let's say, to another organization. But then, to be honest, I think I mentioned these two because they are the more original ones. But in a way, at each step there is always something that you can learn to improve.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Since the pandemic has unfortunately affected everyone on various levels, we're really curious about how this has shaped your role as an ambassador. What sort of challenges have the embassy faced, and what efforts has it taken to address them?
Well, that's an interesting question, because that's another issue another way of describing, let's say, the work of the ambassador. It's extremely varied, as I said. There is, of course, a whole element of management. There is a team to be led, and of course, in the context of the pandemic, the first responsibility you have is to make sure that the staff at the embassy is safe. And so first very obvious thing was to set in place from the beginning very strict rules and procedures so that we could be able to continue working, and at the same time, because we have a duty, of course, to taxpayers in France to carry out our mission, but we also have a duty to the safety of the staff and our external interlocutors. So that was, I guess, a first objective. I have to say that even before the pandemic started in the Netherlands, since we, of course, as everyone at some point understood that it was coming, we had our first meetings in February at the embassy to start planning another way of working. So, well, it has meant, as for everyone, lots of remote interaction and working from home. There have been some variations, but overall we have tried to maximize the work from home. And at this point, I think there are some activities for which presence at the embassy is necessary because of some issues with information systems or that kind of stuff. But overall, I think we are somewhere between 25 and 30% of the staff at any point present at the embassy, and the rest working from home. In that context, as for any manager, a very obvious issue is to make sure that you keep people motivated, that colleagues are not isolated. We have, of course, people that live alone. Also, you have to, it's a little bit as for international students, we have lots of expatriates, so they don't have their families with them, and when the borders close, of course, it's more complicated. You lose the interaction with your family. You don't have your usual sociability networks. Your friends are not here, they are in France. So there is a whole, let's say, specific factor to take into account when it comes to the expatriates. And of course, then we need to keep working. So it means lots of meetings such as this one over the internet. But I guess we've been adapting ourselves well. Now the question for us is which part of this remote work are we going to keep after the pandemic? Because of course it has drawbacks when it's 100%, but it has also some benefits for the staff in terms of the ability for them to articulate their personal life and the work. On the substance, I would say it has changed a little bit, but not so much. I was lucky enough to arrive in the Netherlands before the pandemic, so I had met many of my interlocutors before the pandemic got here. And so I could actually maintain virtually lots of the contacts I had made before. I suspect it's more challenging when you arrive during the pandemic because starting a lot of our work, of course, has to do with trust that you have with people and your ability to know them, to receive ideas or messages or brainstorm on common projects, and that means also lots of informal interaction. And obviously, the interaction through video link are more formal. You lose lots of the human touch, which is really extremely important in our line of job. So the fact that I had contacts from before the pandemic, I think, helped a lot, because it means you are continuing or prolonging an existing relation, and you can do it over the phone or over video link. It's more complicated, I think, if you start directly the relation remotely. But and then on the daily on the issues we covered, of course, there was a change during the first wave of the pandemic. The embassy had to set in place a kind of crisis center to help with the repatriation, as many of our colleagues in other embassies, the repatriation of our citizens stranded abroad. We had a specific issue here, which is that since Air France and KLM are just one company, the hub in Amsterdam was used a lot to bring people back from abroad to Schiphol and then to Paris, and also for Dutch people, many of them transited through Paris. So there was of course a fair share of the activity to keep these routes open as long as we needed people to move back to France. And then I would also add on the substance that a lot of the work we did until the summer, until July, had to do with the European endeavor to set in place a recovery package. As you know, it was a tough negotiation, but in the end, we were able to decide on a 750 billion euros recovery package that we are now going to set in to implement in the next few weeks.
Thank you for answering this question. I think you really put a light on how important it is for the embassy to keep a close relationship to its population. I was particularly impressed about the repatriation. I am personally not aware of a lot of states who did that, so I think that is really impressive. But moving on, I would like to thank you for answering our questions about diplomacy, and we would like to move on to the topic about bilateral relationships. So, seeing as France and the Netherlands have always had a close and lucrative relationship, in your opinion, what makes France and the Netherlands such successful, closely cooperating countries?
Well, I think there is there are structural elements, of course, and mainly, I think, in the present context, the fact that the two countries are key members of the European Union, of course, founding members. We have also a very strong defense relation within NATO, but also beyond bilaterally. We have also a very strong initiatives in the, let's say, in the promotion overall of a rules-based order. So it means that we work very well together on issues related to human rights, for example, or the governance of cyberspace. So we have a very broad, actually, level of agreement in terms of values and also the institutions to which we belong together. That has been there for a while, but I would say that the level of agreement has also increased in the last few years, and we now see France and the Netherlands, despite the fact that they come from different traditions. For example, if you look at issues related to international trade, where with the Netherlands traditionally more open to free trade, and France more on the camp of or on the side of regulation. You now see, I put that in very broad categories, obviously, but you now see, because of the evolution of the international scene, our two countries being able to launching initiatives together, including in this area. So in the spring, for example, our two trade ministers published together a contribution to the European debate on trade, with the specific insistence on the necessity of carbon tax. So we don't say carbon tax, but carbon adjustment mechanism at the border, to make sure that there is a level playing field between our industries, whom we want to see reducing their CO2 emissions, and also our competitors from the outside, who might not be in the same trajectory in terms of reducing CO2 emissions. We also had a couple of months ago in the fall, a joint paper on the regulation of digital platforms. There too, if you had told me 5 or 6 years ago that there would be a joint French-Dutch paper on the management of digital platforms, I would not necessarily have believed that, but it so happens that more and more, because of external pressure, to some extent, we see our agreement, which was already pretty broad, moving to new categories of issues. And then I think it's fair to say that there is an element that has to do with Brexit, of course. For the Netherlands, I can say it because it's written in many public documents. Brexit represents a change, in the sense that the traditional, let's say, liberal free trade partner is now out of the EU, and so we see The Hague trying to find new working relations with new partners. And obviously, I think one obvious possibility in that context is working more with Germany, and I think we see a lot of that. And another one, of course, is to do also more with France. It also is true the other way around, and for the French, who with Brexit have lost their main security partner and defense partner within the EU, which was the UK, there is also a willingness to see what increased cooperations we can have with a country like the Netherlands. And one very good illustration of that was only a few months ago, when we launched a European mission, a security mission in the Gulf region, at the moment where tensions were very, very high in the Gulf. We found the Netherlands being the first country to respond and being able to send naval assets in the Gulf region to participate in that European security mission. So we see also new ways of working in between continental Europeans in this new post-Brexit context.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Picking up on the point of Brexit, as you mentioned, you lost a valuable defense partner with UK. Brexit is a really recent, important, and developing issue for both the European Union right now, as you mentioned, and for France for its external relations as well. Now, on this matter, a lot of companies are moving their headquarters from the United Kingdom to the Netherlands. How do you envision that the economic relation between France and Netherlands will change in the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, I would say first of all that it's already extremely developed. It is not well known necessarily, but we have many French companies who have invested massively here in the Netherlands. The flagship example, of course, is the one I mentioned, the France KLM. But beyond that, but it tends to overshadow a little bit the rest, and there is much more than that going on. So it is true in a variety of sectors, but let me take a few examples. For example, we have Danone, of course, a huge agro-food company, which is very present in the Netherlands since they bought Nutricia, for example. And so really the Netherlands has become the second country or the second leg of that major company. Since we are talking about Brexit and financial sector, it's also not so well known, but the stock exchange of Paris and Amsterdam actually belong to the same company, Euronext, since they merged in the 2000s. So we have our two stock exchanges that are actually working together, and that has been pretty successful. From there, the company has been also able to expand to other European countries, specifically such as Portugal, Norway, and many others, where the stock exchange is actually dealt or managed by this joint French-Dutch company. We have in the energy sector, a company like ENGIE, for example, French company, provides about 20% of the electricity here in the Netherlands, and even in the water management, we have some of the biggest works to protect the country are actually managed by a French company, which is called SPI. So it's pretty, it's really all over the spectrum, I would say, so already pretty intense. And on the other side, we have also many Dutch companies investing in France for research in the agro-food sector or production of or industrial production. Having said that, I think that of course we'll see how Brexit plays. I think it's not completely clear yet. It is true that overall we are in this paradoxical situation. I think France and the Netherlands, which is to be in the category of countries that will be most negatively affected by Brexit, because we are in fact pretty much bordering countries of the Netherlands, whatever that means for of the UK, whatever that means for an island. But we are just in front of the UK, so our trade, of course, will be disturbed in both instances. So the four countries that are most affected, as far as I know, are Ireland, obviously, Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. So we need to adapt to that reality, and at the same time, it's true that many companies don't want to lose their access to the internal market, and so are looking at where to invest. And there, I think it's fair to say that the Netherlands, of course, is doing very well in that regard. France and Germany, to a very large extent, also. Will that create new opportunities to work together? It's very possible. I think some of the very promising sectors for the future are, of course, in high technologies, where we have a very vivid startups ecosystem in Paris and here in Amsterdam. And so if you want to grow and expand quickly, which is of course key to success in that sector, there will be certainly opportunities to working together in the next few years, I think.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for that. And thank you for answering all the questions that we had about diplomacy and bilateral relationships. With your permission, now I would like to move on to the topic of today's event, climate change. So when we speak of ameliorating the effects of climate change, I think harnessing and the utilization of solar energy is considered one of the most effective ways. And to some extent, the International Solar Alliance's objective is that, which France and India jointly initiated. Netherlands being one of the active members of the ISA, how significant do you think this alliance is in terms of combating climate change? And are there any specific tasks that the French embassy in the Netherlands carries out regarding this?
First of all, I'd like to mention the very strong relation we have with the Netherlands in terms of energy transition and climate change. Within the European framework, of course, a key first step within the Paris Agreement is to define our objectives collectively in terms of CO2 emissions reductions. And I have to say that when we pushed a couple of years ago and until last year, and eventually successfully, to increase the level of ambition of our targets for reduction, we always found, as France, the Netherlands with us, lobbying for increased intermediate objectives. As you know, there is an objective of carbon neutrality by 2050, and an intermediate objective of 55% of reduction now, which was 45 before we launched this process, by 2035. It's important because some of our partners, which are also in a complicated spot and depend, unfortunately, a lot on fossil fuels, were more reluctant to increase the level of ambition. But I think we've collectively come to the conclusion that we had there a kind of a paramount issue to be dealt with, and I think we maybe not you, because you're very young, but when you have passed your 40s and you think about what climate was when we not 200 years ago, but only 20 years ago, you now notice the pace at which climate is actually changing almost every year, which I think helps us also understanding the level of urgency we are dealing with. In that framework, I think it's fair to say that all tools need to be used in a sense, and so it depends a lot, of course, on the situation of each country to see what the energy mix must be, but clearly there is a need to reduce massively the use of fossil energies. and that doesn't leave you with too many options in a way. So you have, of course, hydro energy, which is very, very clean, but there are so many rivers that you can use to do hydro. So once you've in a sense done. Once you are at 100% of your potential, which is the case of France, for example, we have dams anywhere we could have them, so it's nice. It gives us 12% of our electricity, but that's certainly it cannot do the whole thing. Then you have renewables, so mainly wind and solar, obviously, and another very big question, I have to say, and as you might see, it's very much debated here in the Netherlands these days, is the place of nuclear energy within the mix, because of course it's an energy that is hotly debated, but it's also true that it has the benefit not to emit almost at all any CO2. In the case of France, our own experience, if you allow me 1 minute on that subject, is that we are currently emitting per capita less CO2, not than the average European. That has been the case for many long time. We are emitting less CO2 than the average inhabitant of the planet. So, which for a developed country is pretty rare. I think we have Sweden here in Europe also doing the same. And it is, to be completely straightforward, really very much linked to the place that nuclear energy has in our energy mix, since it produces 75% of our energy. So if you take nuclear 75 plus hydro that I mentioned 12, you are already at pretty around 90%. And so it means that fossil energies are really residual in our energy mix. Then that doesn't mean it's the only solution to all of our problems, and there are many other possibilities. It depends a lot on again where you are and what kind of energy you can use. So solar has been, as you said, one key endeavor for us. Of course, India has invested a lot in that, and so we have partnered indeed for the increased use of that energy. There are different models, I would say. So it's a nice energy to be also developed at the individual level for households, and myself, I put solar panels within at the French residence here in the Hague, so it produces about 40% of my electricity at the residence. So it can be a very effective tool for decentralized energy consumption, and you have also a model of solar plants. But that, to be fair, works when you have lots of sun, obviously, and lots of space. So it's not necessarily a solution or massive solution for the Netherlands. Not the panels on the houses, but the plants. But there are many countries, including India or in Africa, where you can imagine being, or in the south of Europe, where you can certainly increase a lot the use of solar energy for internal consumption, but also that's another issue where we are working very tightly together between European countries, the Netherlands, Germany, France, and others, with for the production of hydrogen that you can then use as a stock of energy when, of course, your production of renewables decreases, because one of the challenges that there is with these renewable energies is that they are not stable in terms of the output that they give, and so hydrogen can be used as a stabilizer in a way. So what I would say is that we work in all directions in a way to reduce CO2 emissions. So solar is a big one with India, as you mentioned. There isn't a very strong aspect for me here in the Netherlands, because again the major planned projects would not necessarily be in Europe. So it's more a kind of political support to the initiative, but it's also working on wind energy. We have now launched in France a very ambitious program of wind farms offshore. So with 6 very significant projects along the Atlantic and the Channel. And here, of course, in the Netherlands also, since they are blessed with lots of winds, they can also rely on that energy. But I have to say that will not do the trick, and so in the end, there will be questions about using all non-carbon energy sources if we really want to get to a situation of neutrality in terms of carbon emissions.
Thank you,
and let me simply add that's really one of the major subjects for the embassy in general terms. So all possibilities of joint work in all the fields I mentioned, because time is running out, so we need to be moving as steadily as possible.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think you made great points about how important it is, both for the individuals and for the states, to act together in order to stop this climate change and to improve the levels of emission globally. So with your approval as well, we would like to thank you for your questions and to open the floor for questions from the attendees. For those watching from YouTube, feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we will also ask those. Please be aware that priority will be given to those ones raising their hands. You are welcome to introduce yourself before asking the question, or just type it in the chat and we will read out loud. We already have a hand up, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Bianca, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And well, I will first want to say that it was very inspiring having you here today, Your Excellency. And I think I really talk for everyone when I say that how impressed I am about how much you have done and accomplished so far. So it's really nice and yeah, again, inspiring having such a good role model for us international students that want to pursue a career in the international field. Well, my question, it's so the thing is, we will like to have we would like to invite the President, Mr. Emmanuel Macron, the Hague University next time he is in the Netherlands, and possibly also Mr. Prime Minister Mark Rutte. And I know we'll be thrilled to have you as well, Your Excellency, animating a discussion between the President and the Prime Minister and international students in The Hague. So I would like to know do you think that such thing will be possible? Because I know ILSA will be honored to help the French embassy and our university to make this happen. And I know that this will have a huge impact and inspiration on all of us international students in The Hague.
Well, thank you very much for the kind proposal. So, of course, the president does not come every morning to the Netherlands, and last time he came in June, it was simply for a dinner in Scheveningen with Mark Rutte. So a pretty short visit, but at a key moment, because they were discussing, of course, the recovery package. In any case, if he comes back, I will be your strong supporter.
Thank you very much. And knowing how the situation is with the pandemic and everything, we are very flexible on also having it again on WebEx for the safety of everyone. But thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now I see another hand. Lauriane, you have the floor, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Bonjour, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur. Thanks a lot for answering your question. I'm a French national, and I study in the Netherlands. So I was wondering if you thought that working for the Ministère des Affaires étrangères would require me to have a French degree, because you mentioned several French institutions such as l'ENA, Sciences Po. So since I don't have such a degree, I was wondering if you could.
The great thing about the French foreign ministry is that there are different ways to entering it. So the National School of Administration is, of course, one of them. I would simply mention that it's not what you are doing now. In the sense, it's the exam is in itself for students that already have a master's degree, so it comes as a kind of post-university training. So it's always possible to come back home to do that. But otherwise, there are specific exams to enter directly the ministry, either for generalists, or there are also specific exams for students who speak languages that are deemed I wouldn't say rare, because there are usually very large languages at the international level, but whose proficiency is not that common in France. So you have, of course, we have a very strong tradition of outstanding Arabic speakers, for example, at the ministry, or of course there is one exam for colleagues that have an excellent level in Chinese or Japanese, etc. So, but there is also an exam for, let's say, colleagues that are generalists. And then it's always also possible to be at the ministry under contract, so that you're not directly into the diplomatic career, but once you've spent a few years in that in contract positions, there are then specific ways to enter the ministry and remain there, to use your first experience with us and make it a longer term commitment, let's say. So there is the short answer is there is no necessity to have a French degree, though the exam by all means is the exams, because there are several are of course pretty challenging, but there is you can absolutely come from abroad and pass the exam without any constraint, let's say.
Thanks a lot for your answer. Sorry.
No,
My modest advice would be, though, to also try to for French students to try to do maybe internships, and also understanding what the job is, because sometimes, if I'm completely honest, there is a difference between working on international relations or international issues and working for a national diplomacy. So the national diplomacy, even when you work for a state like France or others in Europe, where values are key, and And human rights, for example, are a key element of our work. It's still not exactly the same as working for an NGO or for a non-governmental body, let's say. So you have also to, I think, to make sure that it is the kind of work you want to have. I touched upon that a little bit when I was talking about the press. You also operate in a context where you want to do good, but you also defend the economic interests of your country, and you promote the companies from your country. So not, I mean, you can also be, let's say, you can also want to be free from that constraint, which is very real when you work for a national diplomacy. So I think it's also important to make sure that it is what you want to do as a person. Because there is no way to be good at a job that you don't whose objectives you don't share, I think.
Thank you for your answer, Your Excellency. I'm sure it helped not only French students, but in general, any other student around the globe. So we have another hand up. Maxine, you have the floor, please.
Hi, thank you. As a Dutch national currently studying in an international study, I would like to know how you deal with any cultural differences that you come across in your work.
It's a question I come I come across a lot. Look, of course, we are all different, I think, in essence. And certainly the cultural background plays a role, though. The other day I was giving a prize for scientists. They were chemists, and they were noticing that there are more communalities between a French and a Dutch chemist than between a French non-chemist and a French chemist, or between a Dutch non-chemist and a Dutch chemist. I say that because the way you define yourself strikes me as I mean, there are so many ways of defining yourself. So in essence, maybe as a Dutch person, you have more common ground with another international affairs student from the same university than people who have the same nationality but do not work on the same field. So I'm saying that because sometimes I suspect people like to insist on the issue of cultural differences, and to be honest, I don't perceive them as certainly not as a constraint. Usually, when there exists, there are, and when there are put together, let's say, and I'm not saying that to be politically correct. It's a real observation. You can actually use these differences or play with these differences to come collectively at a better result. And if I see French-Dutch companies, for example, they are doing extremely well by merging the qualities of the different talents, let's say, that you can put together. There are lots of French people, by the way, in very prominent position in Dutch companies, including Booking, ASML, Heineken, and all over the place. And it is also true the other way around. So I would say that I have not seen instances where these so-called cultural differences become an impediment to anything. And also, I would argue that Europeans usually tend to like observing their differences, but if you look at us, but because we because we look at ourselves in a way, so we see the small differences between us. If you look at us from far away, I think we all look alike, and we have, and the common ground is really much larger than the small nuances. And this common ground has a lot to do with the attachment to very core values of individual freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression in general, a sense of equality and non-discrimination. I mean, very core and deeply rooted values that make, I think, the 97% common ground. And then, yes, maybe in the Netherlands, people are slightly more outspoken or direct in their expression, though foreign tourists would tend to think that the French also can be pretty direct in their own ways. So I always come across this kind of simplistic ideas that cultural differences are wide, but I simply don't see it in my daily life, to be honest.
That is an honestly extremely enlightening answer. Thank you very much.
As rightly said, Your Excellency, regardless of the differences, we have to work collectively, and the European Union as a whole is a testament to that for the whole world. Now, moving on to the question in the chat from Felicia. Are there any possibilities for students to work or volunteer at the Embassy of France in the Netherlands?
There is, though, obvious for, I think it's the same for most embassies. First of all, the internships, for example, at the embassy are pretty regulated because there is lots of demand. So there is a whole process that goes to the foreign ministry, then to the embassy. So it's possible, but it's something to prepare in advance, I think. First thing, and then embassies again are not exactly a normal place, I would say. So there might be issues of nationality sometimes, and most of the interns we have at the embassy are in fact French interns, because of questions of classification of information and that kind of things. And I think it's also true from most countries in their embassies. So if I have a small suggestion to do it's not necessarily an absolute constraint, but if I have a piece of advice to give is maybe aim at the embassy of your nationality. Almost, I think there are 120 countries more or less that are represented in the Netherlands. So there is a pretty wide possibility of access, let's say.
Thank you. That answered my question. Merci à vous.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Moving on to another question from the chat. Ms. Corlade is interested if you feel like the current pandemic will have a lasting impact on how international diplomacy is and how it will be conducted.
Yeah, well, I think, including for us at the very local level, it's been a very, I mean, any crisis, of course, is challenging, but is also a way to improve yourself in a way. Yes, I think there will be lasting changes. If I look, for example, at what we do in the cultural sector, I suspect that we won't go back to the traditional exclusively physical events. What we have actually seen, certainly not only online. So we are all eager to regain some capacity to interact. But we have also observed that when we were able to do intermediate or hybrid events with partly physical, partly online, we were actually reaching out to a much broader audience. So yes, I think this notion of hybridity will remain, including for interactions between leaders. They need to meet because lots of what happens, as I said, informally in the corridors by understanding like the very short-term constraint that your interlocutor has. But there is also a fair amount of things that you can actually do online when it's more formal. So I think we'll see a mixture of the old ways and the new ones. I don't expect that things will remain exclusively online, but I expect some hybrid way of working. Yeah. I can't hear anyone at this point.
Yes, I had a problem with my mic. Apologies for that, Your Excellency.
No worries.
Unfortunately, this will be the second last question due to time restraints. So the question is from a Google sign-up sheet that we had. Does a multilateral diplomatic post, such as the ones that you have had when working in the United States of America, require different competence than bilateral diplomatic posts?
Yeah, I think it's not the same. It's really interesting to do both here at the Hague. I love bilateral, I have to say, because it's I tend to think it's more in depth in the sense that you developed projects that can be over many years. I don't know. Let's say opening a new French school in Amsterdam, or creating links between two sectors, companies, administrations, etc. So it takes time. You need to go deeper. You also need to have a very, very vast network of contacts to also facilitate the success of your initiatives. You also have this press side that I mentioned, which is very key, very sensitive, but very important, as you might have seen or you'll see on the internet on the fall. I had to be very present on the Dutch press to explain a little bit our model of integration and the issue around the French concept of laïcité and secularism. So you have lots of explaining to do, lots of in-depth discussion to have. On the multilateral, it's also very satisfactory but it's a different way. It's more in general. It's more negotiation, I would say, more adrenaline, because it's more short term. You have a negotiation. You need to constitute or set in place a coalition to make sure that you win the day. To push your vision of an issue within an organization, to convince people, etc. And of course, when you defend a text, when you promote a resolution and that it ends up being voted, which was the case, for example, last July for us at the OPCW, where we were the key promoter of a decision on the Syrian chemical program. It's of course very satisfactory to see the concrete results come to life in a way, but it's more intense, I would say, in the multilateral. I would say it's more intense and less in depth. So the two are very satisfactory, but in different ways in a way. It's not the same gymnastic.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and thank you for your answers, Your Excellency. Before we finish, we would like to ask you one final question. I'm sure a lot of students are interested in diplomacy and would be even more now after today's experience. So on that note, what would you like to say to students who wish to pursue a career in diplomacy?
Well, as I said, I think make sure that is what you want. Diplomacy, it's not only international relations, it's international relations for one actor, which is a state. So it's a specific way of doing international relations. So I can only advise to make sure that's what you want. Also, if I go to the more challenging, understand the constraints. When you are 20, it seems glamorous to change countries and post every 3 years. When you have a family, children, spouses, etc., it becomes much more challenging to do. But of course, it's also a great way of life. It's not that it has only drawbacks, but you need also to make sure that's what you want. So I think understand the challenges of that type of life, making sure that the substance, of course, is what you want to do, and then once you start, it is indeed a wonderful career because of the diversity of the issues that you can touch upon. As I said, you can be one morning doing economic issues and the other one working on fight against impunity at the ICC or on chemical weapons at the OPCW. And so it is clear that it's a line of job where you will never get bored. So if you're at peace with the constraints of the mission, I think it's a very interesting line of work by all means.
Absolutely, Your Excellency. Thank you so much for that. I'm sure, Your Excellency, I speak for everyone when I say this, that we could not have had a more stimulating discussion today. On behalf of the Hague University of Applied Sciences and the International Law Student Association, the Hague chapter, we'd like to thank you so much for taking the time today and gracing us with your presence. We'd also like to thank your office. Without their cooperation, this would not have happened. I'm certain our attendees learned a lot today from you, from your passion for diplomacy, and particularly, besides many things, the one that I took most importantly is to push ourselves, to hone our skills, and I believe you're the epitome of that for us. Thank you so very much for joining us today, and I'm certain it resonated with all of the students present here today.
Thank you so much for having me, and I hope we can get in touch in a less virtual way one of these days.
Absolutely, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And for everyone else interested, do not forget that we have one more event today starting at 4 p.m. Dutch time with the Ambassador of Argentina to the Netherlands. For even more information, please feel free to check our social media accounts. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks again.
Bye-bye.
Excellency.
Merci
Bye,
beaucoup.
everyone.
Au revoir.